Once again, welcome to the podium, USC Board of Trustee member, Amy Ross.
I want to tell you a little bit about the Center for LGBT Health Equity. It was created to lead the scientific inquiry into the physical, emotional, and social health of LGBTQ youth, adults, families, and guide best practices for achieving health equity for this population. The work of the center is guided by scholars, as you'll see, community leaders, and nationally recognized experts in the field of LGBTQ health, who are committed to advancing research, collaboration, training, and outreach activities that facilitate dialogue, and most importantly, broaden awareness and promote social change. So we have a wonderful closing panel today, and it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Sherry Schrager, and she's going to take it off from here. So welcome, and thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. So I am representing our center on behalf of Dr. Jeremy Goldbach, who unfortunately had a missed flight coming back from Brazil and is not able to make it today. So we will do our best to represent our work to you, but if you have questions, I suspect we'll be able to answer anything you might want to know, but you're also welcome to reach out to him, and I know he's very, very disappointed that he couldn't be here today. He was really looking forward to this. So a little background on me and the circuitous path that I took to get here. I've always had to, really going back to high school, I've been fascinated by people and I've been fascinated by math. So I did that in college, I wound up doing that in grad school. I actually got my doctorate in psychology and got a secondary master's in statistics while I was there. I was fortunate to have funding during grad school that allowed me to pursue the secondary degree. And I began my career as a biostatistician working with Michelle Kipke, who's USC faculty, at Children's Hospital Los Angeles on the Healthy Young Men study, which was a longitudinal study of young men who have sex with men, a 5-year major federal study looking at health outcomes and experiences of violence and victimization, but also resilience. And so the path I've taken since then, it's kind of funny. You think you go in and school is about studying something, doing research, having your topic, having your plan, and really digging deep. And I have found so much more. It becomes about who you meet and who you get to know along the way. And certainly that is how I've wound up here through the course of that. I met various people, including other faculty at USC, through a few connections from them. I met up with Jeremy just as he was finishing his doctorate, and he had wanted to consult with me about some analyses that he was trying to do as he was publishing his dissertation work. And we got to know each other and started working together and wound up pitching what became our first federally funded grant, which was an NIH R21 to develop the first validated measure of minority stress among sexual minority adolescents. And so everything we've done since then has been capitalizing on that early success and really trying to figure out how can we turn this into something bigger. So he and I will talk, ideas. We have all kinds of ideas, and we'll refine them together, work through them together. But at one point, he said, we could keep doing this forever, right? We can, the two of us, sit down, write a grant, get some funding, do a project, write another one, get the next funding, or we could turn this into a real engine. And so at the time, it was the LGBT Health Equity Initiative, because at USC, you can't call something a center until it has some official backing and some dollars coming in. But we realized we really wanted to start something that would be bigger than us, bigger than any of our individual projects, bigger than this 3-year grant or this 5-year grant, but really a force to drive an agenda toward equity, toward really getting people interested, giving them a place, a landing place, and being able to connect the wider community with scholars who are really interested and passionate about this work. So currently, he is the director of the Center for LGBT Health Equity. I am the director of the Methods Core, I believe. That's what we decided to call me. I'm still a methodologist at heart, and outcome-wise, I'm committed to any research that advances health equity. Our work is in minority stress, and that has now led me to be more interested in suicide prevention, understanding suicidality, and how we can work to prevent it and lower the rates of attempts and the rates of depression and other mental health concerns. But I think we're really at a point where we want to support any work that people are interested in that falls in the realm of health equity and pursuing equality. And so I see myself as somebody, and the reason I've sort of directed this methods core and put a team together is because I think you want to be doing the best science possible. And so I'm bringing back my other interest in, in maths and statistics, but really in science and in doing the best possible science. I think this population deserves no less from us, and in fact should expect the absolute best from the research that goes on. And so I have put together a group, and I think about that arm of the center as a resource so that everybody can pursue the research that they're interested in and do it as well as possible and have it be as reliable as possible and stand the test of time so that we can really make real change in the world. So that's me.
So I'm a doctoral student. So there's a number of us, as you can see from the center. Ankur and I are doctoral students. There's also undergraduate and undergraduate student and staff on the center. So you'll hear perspective from all of us on our perspective working in the center. My name is Cary. I'm a social worker and a PhD candidate here at social work, and I'm in the Center for LGBTQ Health Equity. I study right now, I was meeting with Sherry just the other day to unpack my dissertation data, which has been a very complicated but fun process. It's been very arduous moving through a doctoral program, and I'm at a place now where I'm really starting to enjoy it and enjoy the work that I do, and to see that the work that I do can have some type of impact, even if it's at this point, an article that's published, that's read by just a couple of peers and colleagues, that it will have an effect, and I can see that as I move forward. There'll be interesting things to come. So what do I study in the lab? My dissertation right now looks at the schooling experiences of transgender adolescents, as well as their parents and their caregivers, and what that looks like across 3 different data sets that I'm using. The first is data from the entire state of Colorado at 2 different time points. And it's going to look at reports of school violence, school safety, perceptions of the school climate, teachers, and mental health and suicidality over these 2 time points in a really large public health data set. The second kind of independent study within my larger dissertation project will utilize data that was collected through kind of the granting process that Sherry was talking about, that looked at youth accessing services in the Trevor Project. Accessing the Trevor Project, I'm sure many of you are aware, is an LGBTQ youth suicide prevention hotline. And Sherry and others up here on stage worked over a number of years to collect data from youth accessing those services. And so I'm going to look specifically at transgender youth, some of their reports around supportive schools and supportive teachers, and how that might interact with experiences of suicidality. Well, I haven't done all the analysis yet, but I can say that in the data, yes, of course it does. When we live in a world that, or an environment that supports us for who we are in a way that we can be authentic, whether it's through our sexual expression or identity, or our gender expressions and identities, and that we're affirmed in those things, I'm obviously singing here to the choir. If we're affirmed, then we'll have better health outcomes. As scientists, we're really focused in on that health outcome that's measured, but I think I'm trying to always come back to the broader focus, which is that measure, that phenomenon that we look at through the survey is representative of a more fulfilling, well-lived life. So that's the second study. The third study has been a lot of fun. The third study of my dissertation project. I've been working with a doctoral candidate at UCLA in their School of Social Work who applied for an NIH National Institute of Health grant that Sherry was talking about earlier, and received some funding to interview transgender students across Southern California and one of their parent caregivers, to ask them questions about their life across domains of living, from home to school to community. And it's really been an inspiring, informative, emotional process to travel all over Southern California, interview families, see what it's like inside of that family unit, and to understand how do communities interact with queer people really, what are the really positive, outstanding experiences that we can, as social workers and researchers, report to the communities, professionals. This is how we can affirm, and this is what affirmation looks like. And then also to report, what does a lack of affirmation look like? Of course, because my dissertation project looks at schooling specifically, I'm going to look in that data and do qualitative analysis of the interviews, of the narrative, to understand what the schooling experiences look like. That's where I'm at right now, where I'm coming from. I went to UC San Diego, grew up in LA, but went to UC San Diego and actually studied Japanese and international relations. Did not see this one coming, did not see myself ending up here. But through my undergraduate experience, I got involved with campus activism and campus community building and was an intern at the LGBT Resource Center at UCSD. I was a Silvia Rivera intern for politics. And I realized, for me, I was interested in going abroad to Asia and working in international relations. That for me at that time, I saw impact, meaning being here with my community and trying to understand and build, which led me to then Teach for America, where I was a teacher for a really short period of time, and then, which is very difficult. It's very difficult work to be a teacher. For me, it was. And that led me to understanding my own skills, my own areas where I could really shine, and that was to work with folks one-on-one. That led me to an HIV services organization in San Diego, where I was a prevention counselor. I worked on a syringe exchange program, and really felt like, okay, this is where I see my professional life as a social worker. So that's my primary identity within a kind of STEM. I understand that this is a STEM conference, and we're using the tools of science, technology, engineering, and math to understand the lives of LGBTQ people, and it's been really fun. There's a lot of work ahead.
Thanks.
Yay.
Hi, that's loud. I'm Ankur Srivastara. I'm a PhD candidate again at School of Social Work here at USC. I'm also with the center and involved in usually multiple studies, and also currently I'm also looking at managing the lab, which just means we have a lot of RAs, undergrad students actually from health schools which volunteer and work with us over the entire semester. So I'm also looking some of those aspects. Just a background of myself, I came from Mumbai, India 4 years ago for my PhD over here. And so I did all my studies in India. I remember the first study which I did 11 years ago was around LGBT for my first master's. And it was, the idea was to, in the process, to also understand myself. So it was very looking at hey, I want to get into the LGBT spaces. I was also already in a social work program, so there was a sense of acceptance in terms of certain kind of issues, but it was but still LGBT research was not really a thing back in the day, at least in schools and academia so one of the very first studies I did was just basically trying to understand hey, can I read more literature, interact with more people, do more interviews in a process just to understand myself, right? That's how my first study went. And then in the process I met really amazing people in back in Mumbai who are doing a lot of good research work in LGBT communities. And that's how I started working with the non-profit based in Mumbai in the research unit of there. And that's how I started also working on a lot of National Institute of Health with US universities and Canadian Institute of Health Research with University of Toronto, a lot of projects coming out from there. In those few years, I kind of realized that when I go back to school, I was also doing my another master's MPhil, and I realized it was really difficult because in academia over there, you do not get to work with people who are working on LGBT issues. So the closest you will work is people who are interested in gender issues or looking at women and work or women and health issues, and they're okay, fine, one LGBT research, yes, you can work with me, kind of a thing. So it was really interesting because for the most part of me, I never actually I felt I got mentored in academia in that way, because my professors never really understood any of the issues which LGBT people are facing as such. So my dissertation writing was more of hey, fascinating, looks so interesting, but nothing more critical, analytical issues being discussed. But on my other work side with the non-profit, it was very quantitative, it was very specialized, intense, rigor and everything. And also in the meanwhile, I also came to US, met a couple of more professors, and we had a lot of exchange between US and India over there happening. And in the process, I realized that I really want to pursue a PhD in which there is more scientific rigor to it, and I'm doing things that make much more sense than what I was doing back there. And more importantly, I had this entire idea, I want to work with an advisor who understands LGBT issues. I had like this whole fascination about working with people or group of people who know what I'm doing and what I'm talking about and help me understand and work on these issues. I was a very qualitative researcher back in India, and then when I moved into USC, it's a very different scheme here. Like it's very quantitative, heavily quantitative focus actually. So I was like, okay, this is interesting. So I've like worked my through these last 4 years working on that. Thematically, I've always been interested in looking at identities, and that's what I've always explored in all the studies, most of the studies I've done, which is basically looking at how identities are associated with outcomes, right? And just that, like when I started having conversations in the School of Social Work at USC, the end result was to talk about you just can't understand identities as a fascinating nature and like how they progress and stuff like that. You need to understand how they impact people's lives, right? You need to have an outcome in head and mind to talk about it. So the things I started talking about was like how developmentally, if you look at changes in identity, like identity development and how that impacts one's health outcomes like mental health, suicidality, substance use, like behavioral health outcomes in general. Starting from there, I remember, so I did like multiple projects with Jeremy, Dr. Goldbach in the center, and for my dissertation now, I'm looking at one of the data studies we did was with Trevor project. We were looking at evaluation of their services, and we recruited about like 600 plus kids who are taking Trevor services, and we followed them for like 30 days. Like I had a 30-day follow-up. So it was a really great data set, but my specific interest is in population with gender non-conforming youth. So what I did was I went back to those kids and I took a smaller sample of like 170 people, and I followed them for almost a year period, which is like doing data collection every 3 months. So the idea was to understand how changes are happening over a period of time. Like for example, like most of the studies that we look at in LGBT research, again, like it's not really new, but also it's not really old as such, like compared to research on substance use in social work or research on delinquencies or family and child. It's not that old as well, right? So we still are taking like, you can see taking some baby steps in that project, in that space, right? So the idea was to understand like how health outcomes are changing over a period of time. Like how, like for example, if I ask depression, I can get at one time cross-sectionally, but it doesn't tell me like entire picture of the person, right? If I ask people over a period of time, I get a better understanding of how they're feeling, how they're reacting, and vis-a-vis understanding like what are the processes that are happening along those changes in health outcomes. And I think it was not intentional. At some point we realized that every time we go and ask these kids about their sexual and gender identity, they give us a new word, right? And we wanted to understand, is it actually just an arbitrary thing that every time you ask they give a new word, or it is actually something associated with the health outcomes? Because a lot of studies are already published talk about like bisexual men or pansexual men have worse outcomes compared to gay and lesbian kids, right? So we wanted to understand like if people are also changing and reporting a different identities, if also like their stresses and everything else is changing. So part of my dissertation work is actually on that part of it, which is basically now I'm looking at changes in gender and sexual identities over a period of time. And I'm trying to understand how every time each reported change in identity, how that is associated with like increased or changes in stresses, the experiences, and also how those changes are associated with actual health outcome in the population. So this is like probably the current project that I'm working on for my dissertation. I'm also like carried towards the very end of the tunnel, hopefully to graduate by next year or so. But I think like one of the craziest thing which I found about working with the lab was that I got to work with a lot of people who have really good expertise and also a lot of stuff to bring on the table in terms of LGBT studies. So it was like really great working with the colleagues. Like we have actually a lot of us in the program who work on LGBT issues. So it's always like really nice to have a young bunch of people coming in and talking about issues and writing papers.
There's many more than just
there are many more than just two of us from the school right now.
That are PhD students.
In the PhD program. So, thanks.
Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. My name is Joe Rissacher. I am a staff member of CLHE. My role is a social media manager. And so what I do is I take the research and all of the work these guys do, and I create and develop and publish social media content that's easy to understand for the general LGBT community, for people who are just interested in learning about LGBT health disparities. It's basically taking all the academia language, right, and all the data that people who aren't within the research community wouldn't normally understand, and then I develop infographics and different visualizations to really communicate that. And so I got started as a college student. I was so I'm formerly a digital marketing expert, and I started out as a marketing and communications coordinator for Planned Parenthood. And so I advertised specific services within 10 health centers in New York. And this was through digital marketing channels as well as at events. And so I've always been really involved with the LGBT community. I'm really passionate about activism and being involved in the community itself, in person, online, etc. And yeah, and that was basically my starting point, working for Planned Parenthood, and there was a lot of overlap with the LGBT community there because a lot of it was also advertising specific services such as hormone replacement therapy and HIV testing. And then since then, that was 2 years ago, and now 2 years later, I've been involved with the center, and I'm really fortunate to be working with these guys. Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Brendan. I'm currently a senior at USC, and I work as a research assistant currently for the Train Your Brain study, which is going on, which John will talk about later. But I also have worked for Ankur on his different studies, and I've been with this team for about 1.5 years now, and it's been really interesting working with them, especially just kind of the people who are working with the LGBT youth. I kind of grew up not really knowing what kind of like an at-risk population was and how important it is for to do research like this. And so it's been really interesting actually conducting the studies and seeing the different stories from kids and what like at-risk populations really kind of need. And so I think it's really important that, I think it's just really important to see like how the results from these studies are and how they can be applied to so many different things. And so for the Trevor Project, that was my first like real experience into research. I actually started as a film major here and decided I did not want to do that. So then I came into the science background and research. And so I really kind of got in by chance, and I had to learn, as you were saying with the social media, kind of putting it in layman's terms. And so I had to read up and see what exactly these studies were doing, the population, and that was very much my intro. And then in working that, I got to start on the Train Your Brain study, which is a little different in terms of the people they are working with, but actually what can be done with it can also be applied to the LGBT community, which is very important. It's a really interesting study to see how that's progressed. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
And I'll go into a little bit more about that study too. My name is John Senese. I am a social worker here at USC, and I work for the Center for LGBTQ Health Equity. So I'm a project specialist, so I work on different projects. I am kind of a liaison between the research assistants and the PIs. My background actually started in nutrition and community health. I was in a school in upstate New York, and I was fascinated by nutrition and health disparities. But then I actually noticed health disparities in upstate New York were driven by social factors, substance use, a lot of psychological factors, and that really made the connection between nutrition and mental health for me. So I started to pursue psychology, and then ended up in social work. I loved neuroscience, and I felt that I was giving up neuroscience to go into social work. Coming here to USC, I realized that is not true. There's a huge part, so that's where the Train Your Brain study comes in. That is a study that we're looking at trauma. It is alpha theta neurofeedback and amygdala targeted neurofeedback. And we're just looking at how trauma can be reduced with feedback and how targeting the amygdala can show people what is working for them. So say you're meditating, you don't know if it's working or not. If you are meditating with our cap on your head, you can see as people sit in their chair, you're playing a video game, so as you start to win the video game, what you're doing is working. So you know this is working, and then that reinforcement kicks in, the operant conditioning, and then you notice, okay, I'll keep doing this. Because this study is showing decent results with the greater trauma community, results can definitely be attributed to the LGBTQ community for future directions because of the trauma that takes place in the brain as you hold something so close to you, as you're constantly aware, as you grow up of everything going on around you. That trauma that slowly develops can end up as something that has an impact on you, similar to the way an acute trauma would happen. So that's a direction that we're going with that study. I also work on the asset study, which is the longitudinal study that we were discussing. That one is looking at health determinants over a 5-year or 3-year period with 14 to 17-year-olds, and we're just going to track them. But with that study, I am working on recruitment, and I just kind of get to be a part of the lab, and whatever holes need to be filled, whatever gaps there are in the research, I kind of come and play with that and then fill those areas. So yeah, it's been great working with the team. There's definitely a lot of different research that we're doing, but what really hits me close to home is that it all kind of comes from the same root, and that is we're looking at health promotion in the LGBTQ community, and that gap is the gap that I am striving to fill.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for sharing the backgrounds. It's so fascinating, even though these are people I know and I work with on an almost daily basis. It's always interesting to hear people fill in the gaps of how they got here. One of the questions I have for the panel is to talk a little bit about where you fall on the basic applied continuum. And so to broaden this for everybody, we talk, in science about very basic research, which is really theoretical, very lab-controlled settings, very tight controls to understand phenomenologically what's going on. And then you go all the way across the continuum to as applied as possible, where you're working in the real world with real live people and trying to make a change. And I will say that I came to my career as almost like a reactance response. I was so angry 3 years into graduate school when a faculty member who would later go on to become the chair of the department basically said, oh yeah, applied research is important. I mean, that's for other people to do, implying that we're too good for that. And I kind of said, what are we doing here if we're not going to help anybody? And I made a hard left turn into research that I thought would actually reach real people. And at the same time, it's interesting being in a social work environment where you realize even at the most applied end of the spectrum, you're still at a remove. We're not doing, in our research, we're not doing direct services provision with clients. Many of our folks here do that as a separate component, either of their training or of their work. But in research, you're still one step removed. So I'm hoping folks can weigh in on, how do you feel about where you fall in that continuum and the extent to which you feel you're actually able to help people with the work you do?
Yeah. I think I was thinking about, if it's okay if I go first.
Of course.
I was thinking about sharing with all of you about the reason why I chose social work. I was in that HIV services clinical setting, providing direct services on syringe exchange as an HIV test counselor, substance use and abuse counselor, etc. And I thought, man, I wasn't a therapist. I was doing brief interventions, and I thought, everyone just needs a really good therapist, and the problems would be solved as a naive early 20-something. And it's really the theory that we use primarily in our work, minority stress theory, that helped me to realize that it is social stigma, that is kind of the primary predictor of the human health and wellness that we study, that it's understanding and intervening to stop the impact, reduce stigma, and stop its negative impact on health that is really important and needed right now in LGBTQ health research. So where do I fall in that continuum? Well, we're not running experiments in a lab, or we are collecting data from people that are accessing services and out in the field. So we're not all the way in theoretical, though we're still trying to understand that theory of minority stress, that kind of pathway from experiences of stigma to health outcomes. And so we're not all the way over here. I would say like I'm somewhere in the middle, if that's an appropriate answer, because I'm taking the survey responses and the narrative that I'm getting from folks in the field, but then I'm applying it to a theoretical idea to understand. The literature is actually so limited on LGBTQ people's health that we can't for sure say that stigma causes negative health. As an LGBTQ person with many, LGBTQ friends and being of that experience, I think it's quite clear to me that stigma and discrimination has played a traumatic role in my own life at certain points, and that it really impacts the people I've worked with as a social worker and a professional, but we don't have the data to say that connection exists. So I feel like the work that I do is in the middle to closer to that theoretical side than really applied, which is unfortunate, but
you're seeing how the work that you do as a scientist will eventually help people. If you can gather evidence in support of the theory, you can create interventions and test interventions that can actually help. And that, in turn, will actually make a difference in the broader community.
I think a good example, quickly on that, is the very first paper that I had published showed that access to affirmative hormone therapy for transgender women in the county of San Francisco, county or city, reduced outcomes of depression by and large. So, people that set policy can look at that and say, okay, we need to ensure that there's access to affirmative health procedures, and that may reduce population level depression. So.
Great. Anyone else? Don't have to go in order.
So the answer in terms of the continuum has changed a lot for me, just because of geographically. So back in India, I was working with a research center that was based out of a non-profit. That was an intervention. The primary work was intervention. Research was like part of it that was kind of help, right? So the good thing that we used to see in our work was all the kind of research work that we are doing over there, it was actually really going back to the intervention. So for example, like if we do like any of the studies and we find you do these changes and make these changes, but the changes were actually getting implemented right then and there, because we were not like working in a larger system, take approvals, this and that. It was like a non-profit to having their own intervention, and we could actually suggest changes over there. So it kind of felt like more somehow fulfilling. And also I remember like, I feel like I've always felt more connected to the community because I was working in that space. Like it was on a everyday basis, I was I was like interacting with more people, just getting the understanding of the field over there. Coming over here, I think that part has completely changed now. Most of the interviews and everything I do is like online, so that means sometimes they get coded as just like a number, participant ID, more than often. But at the same time, I also see that the things that we are doing over here can have larger impact. Like in the sense, like we are doing more scientifically informed, rigorous research work, and which is theoretically driven. We are actually designing models, and we are actually developing like measures, for example, SMASI, which actually have really great implications. For example, like one of the studies I recently did, and it was like coming from the Trevor data set again, was basically looking at like how when people call in the services and what kind of services they are getting, right? So one of the things that I was trying to understand was doing some kind of latent class modeling was if people tell me their gender and sexual identity, I can try to understand what kind of issues they might have. So for example, a person may be calling for saying suicidal ideation, but at the same time, if I know that the person is, let's say, pansexual and gender non-conforming, I also understand that this person is also at higher risk of, let's say, depression and anxiety based on modeling. So probably I should also be screened for those things. So I think like that way, I think like we are in that still continuum of like the applied research, because a lot of recommendations and the findings that we have are very like spot on somehow, like in a sense like this is what the reality is and the factual is. But at the same time, some bits are missing because we are not the one who are actually carrying out the interventions, right? We can only provide our insights or provide like our recommendations for that matter, but we can't really do much more than that. So I think like a part of me also thinks like our current work now, when we are actually engaging with a lot more organizations and like non-profits and others, it's actually helping more. For example, Trevor project was conducted with Trevor, right? So we had this understanding that what we are recommending, the analyses and everything will actually go back to them and they will work on intervention, revising the intervention. So I think like there is a connect, just that I still think there's a connect, but probably like we need to engage probably with communities and non-profits a little more.
Anybody else wants to?
I will say that I'm also in the middle. So I have worked as a therapist, a social worker at the LGBT Center in Long Beach, and there I have noticed there is both, the need for both of these sides, because if I have a client come in who has a need for services, maybe a support group, or maybe they're exploring their identity, or maybe they have a recent HIV diagnosis, or maybe they don't know a diagnosis, or maybe they're thinking of a greater picture but they don't know where to receive testing, things like that will cause anyone anxiety. That type of research shows you what services to give. But then coming from the trauma side, a lot of the research on it does have applied to certain populations, sort of directions on what to take. But really, a lot of the work that you do with somebody is based off theory. It's based off being curious about yourself, exploring things, and those theories are still being worked out. So when somebody comes in, there is that immediate need for services. There's also a greater picture that will continue. So just as Cary was saying, he was working with people giving those immediate resources and services. When you do the long-term thing, it kind of does come down to theory, and it comes down to exploring yourself, not exploring the research that's out there. But the therapist or the social worker, they're the one who's using that theory to then guide the practice. And you never know which direction it's going to take. There is no clear guideline. So yeah, I definitely think I'm both, because there's still a lot to explore, but there's a lot that has already been explored that can cause an immediate decrease of symptoms, such as depression, anxiety, and the typical things that you would see when somebody comes into your office for the first time.
All right. So one thing this makes me think about that might be of interest to our audience is everyone sort of had these different career transitions. You've done different kinds of work in your life to get to this point. Can you talk a little about that and what you've wrestled with and what your personal experience was deciding, this has been good, but it's time for me to do something different and I can make a difference doing something else than what I've been doing?
I have sort of had a divide between clinical work and research, and at the LGBT Center, I really realized I love the clinical work in a research setting. There's a lot to explore when you have an LGBT client, and being LGBT myself, I have a lot to explore, and I noticed I was sort of exploring as they were, which to me meant that I still have my own exploration to do before I kind of guide people through theirs. My supervisor there would say that is absolutely not true. There is a way to go in together, and that strengthens you as a clinician. But I sort of have that research side that really calls me. And because I'm doing clinical research, that I've noticed is just where I fit best. You get the best of both worlds. You get to explore, but you also get the data. So that exploration stops at a point, and then you're able to provide resources for somebody to kind of continue that exploration. And then you use what they have explored to then kind of guide your practices and make the next step as time goes on. So I really like the clinical research, sort of seeing where that takes me.
Yeah, I have a really similar experience. When you ask about needing to change a job, I think for me, what that is, and the difficulty in that, it's about transitioning, an identity.
Exactly.
When I talked about leaving the HIV services setting to come to become a professional social worker and ultimately a PhD student, I wanted to become a therapist. I felt like I wanted to become a social worker, a clinician, to provide services. And the PhD program has been very difficult because it's challenged my understanding of my own identity, my identity as a professional and a scientist. Coming into a PhD program, especially at a school like USC, you are taught that you are a scientist first and primarily. Sherry talked about, her role in the center, and all of our role is to do solid scientific research. That at times will be in conflation with social justice and activism. And as a queer person, the personal is political. How do you navigate that? I've had a lot of questions around my own role, and I think at times the PhD program was very difficult. But coming to a point where today I can do work that is on that theoretical side, and I can understand and see how the connections from theory to truly just lab theory or human behavior theory to social service kind of macro level policy connect. And then thinking about what you shared, being a therapist in an office and having my own experiences with queer folks and syringe exchange services in clinics, there's a total connection. And I can use the tools of science to promote social justice and to be an activist. And that doesn't mean it doesn't have to be high quality research. And it doesn't mean that all that other stuff doesn't matter if I want to be a scientist or a researcher. So it's a big navigation. And I think as a queer person, it's even more difficult because there's lots of structures in place in academia and in the professional world that don't necessarily invite you in. So something I'm still definitely navigating, but.
Yeah, I will say that's a real challenge, and that's one that I've encountered in my own work as well. When you have this tension between data, doing rigorous science and rigorous analysis and dealing with what's on the page versus what you feel in your heart is right. And I think, so I can give an example. We have one of the first national cohorts of transgender youth who are starting cross-sex hormones with Joanna Olson Kennedy now at CHLA. And I was working with her on a study that's the precursor to the big national study that is still ongoing there. And we have some data. We assessed these young people every 6 months, and we have data that show rapid just improvement in everything: reduced gender dysphoria, lower depression, higher quality of life, satisfaction, all this stuff at 6 months, and then a decrease at the 1 year mark. And this surprises nobody because these people are still adolescents, and life is hard, and life is very, very hard for teenagers, especially trans teenagers. And hormones are not a magic wand that fixes everything in your life. Your peers are still jerks, and your parents are still difficult, and teachers are terrible, whatever else. They're still adolescents. They still have the stresses of daily life. What we believe is happening is this is fixing one critical fundamental problem in their life, but it doesn't make everything else go away. But the problem is, if you just publish that, someone is going to use that to say, all right, we should just deny hormones to trans teens because clearly it doesn't help. And so figuring out how to put that message out there in a safe way for the population has been a real challenge for us, and it's still something we're wrestling with. So I think you can take a social justice approach to the values. You can use that to guide your research and say, this is important. It's important because that is just. And then you can use the rigorous science to address the questions that you've decided based on your values are important to address.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, thank you. That was really interesting. Thank you so much for that great presentation. And we have about 15 minutes for some questions from the floor. While we get the microphone going, I'll start off. One of the things, and I was recently working on some education issues with administration for USC just last week in Washington, D.C. And one of the things we see through administration, and particularly some DHHS policies, is that this community, particularly our youth, I think, are going through, for lack of a better word, re-stigmatization.
Yes.
And we see some of that institutionalized. We see some of that just in the way the community is treated. How do you view the work that you're doing with this initiative and trying to combat some of the forces that are being institutionalized in education, particularly for our youth these days, that I find very troubling?
Well, I think Cary alluded to it earlier. We're sort of at an impasse because if you're dealing with, depending on which level of administration you're dealing with, if you have people who are not interested in facts or science, we have a very tough road ahead of us. But we have to appeal to the lawmakers and the people in power who are at least open to understanding the data. But I see us as a real force for change, because the more data we can collect, the more clear patterns we have to say, these experiences matter, these experiences have potentially lifelong consequences, and we don't even have to draw, connect the dots for them, that therefore we need to work on having less stigma. If you know that stigma and violence and discriminatory experiences lead to these health outcomes, take this away, it gets better. We can say that, but often if we're able to show them the data, they will come to that on their own, and I think that's even a more powerful experience than just saying, well, you shouldn't victimize people because it's wrong. I mean, that's obvious, but that hasn't fixed anything. So at least if we can say, here's the outcomes. If things continue like this, here's what's going to happen. Perhaps we should try improving these and see what it does to the outcomes.
And I think that in these instances where there's just a total impasse with policies or political perspectives that aren't respecting or valuing science, like you're saying, that's where I can rely on the tools that I have and the technology that I have as a social worker, because science is just one of those tools. But as social workers, we can also use the tools of arts and humanities to educate and affirm and uplift and to strategize. So it takes a village.
Yeah. I will say this is where people like Joe are incredibly valuable to us. A lot of us on the faculty side spend a lot of time yelling at other faculty at our institutions, at other institutions. We go to conferences and have this conversation, and it can feel like preaching to the choir sometimes. We badly need the services of people to take what we're doing, and we have government advocates as well. But people who are spreading the message to the public, to the lawmakers, to the policymakers, it's vital, and one person can't do everything. So yeah, it really does need a whole team.
Interdisciplinarity is how we solve these grand challenges.
Totally.
Thank you.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you. My question is if there's anything known from either studies or personal experience about culturally specific, either clinical practice or maybe social media campaigns. I'm assuming, for instance, here in LA, being so multicultural that either Spanish-speaking or Mandarin-speaking therapists would have advantages, but do we know anything more deeply in terms of insights?
Interesting.
I could just talk based on like some of the research work which we recently did. So we were looking at, I'm gonna translate and use like cultural experiences as racial experiences in the conversation I'm talking about. So we were looking at like experiences of LGBTQ from different races, looking at diversity and their experiences in workplaces, and looking at workplaces where like research, academia, like entrepreneur, like their own private spaces, businesses everywhere. So in the interviews it was really interesting, the things that we have found out. Few things that were like, yes, we already knew, but we don't talk about is about racism and also in academic spaces. And it was very interesting to talk about, because a lot of times they were talking about was that how certain kind of expression of identity is permitted and certain kind of expression of identity is not permitted. So yes, universities are trying to be more diverse and more accepting and inclusive and this and that. But at the same time, when you are going into those spaces, there's always that backlash. Like you have to portray yourself and express yourself in a way that is considered to be more accepting, rather than and not invite confrontation. And also like in terms of experiences of microaggression, they were common for everyone, all LGBT population that we interviewed, but specifically much higher for people of color. And their experiences have been like very different. For example, like, and also like when I say multiple experiences, also about like gender as well. Like I've interviewed people and talking about like how there were 3 people who started this initiative, and now this is a 20-year-old initiative. But when they actually talk about it, they just talk about the 2 males who started this initiative, and the third person has just become like, has faded from the entire memories, right? And because she was a woman. So I'm saying like those things have also happened, and people keep talking about it. And especially people of color and their experiences in research settings or academic settings, where they keep talking about like how like they have to always cannot be too ethnic, they can't be too like racially like obvious in those spaces, they have to always like kind of merge in. not to disrupt the peace and harmony that is there in those spaces. And also, like, sometimes really it was awkward for me to also hear that a lot of the experiences were coming from School of Social Works, which is like places where we are supposedly one of the most liberal, inclusive people, and it was like, yeah, this is a matter of reality. People of color have, and LGBT have very diverse experiences.
I will say the trend in our literature is toward recognizing the importance of intersectionality in our research and really trying to understand the whole person and all of the potential identities that they may carry with them. It's not clear to me at this point that it's reached the level of intervention where we have really strong intersectional interventions, and I think that is where we need to be going. At least in our lab, we're working on recognizing that perspective when we're doing recruitment for our studies and data collection. So we're looking at our ads and saying, do we need to do this in multiple languages? Do we need to swap out the people so that more people can see people on the ad that look like them, and maybe that will be more inviting so we can recruit a more diverse sample. But we're taking our first steps into that, as are, I think, a lot of other researchers across the country. It's not clear to me that anybody has the solution yet.
Yeah, just to add to what she was saying, like, intersectionality is amazing. We all know, we kind of accept that is true and everything. There are layers of meanings and everything. But at the same time, when you're actually doing research studies and you want to explore and measure intersectionality, is a nightmare. It's just so difficult to do it. Yeah. And when you're designing, thinking about interventions and intersectionality, it's just like, it's a totally different ballgame. So it's, yes, we recognize there is intersectionality, but we still feel very limited in terms of what we can actually do about it. Yeah.
And I will say, this is a point I wanted to make at some point, so I'm just going to put it out there now. This is why representation in our science is so very important, why we need people from, we need you, we need your friends, we need your colleagues, we need everybody, because if you have a monolith that is controlling the science, they're going to miss this stuff. They're not going to come up with the answers. We need representation from many, many, many different kinds of people to do the best possible science. And it has to be the people involved in the decision making, who's deciding the funding, who's designing the studies, who's carrying out the studies. It has to be across the board. So I'm so excited this panel exists today and that this conference exists here, because we badly need this.
So true. Question right over here, and then we'll come down to the front table.
Hi, so I guess my question is going to end up being a little bit similar to the last question. Yeah, I kind of got curious about this when one of you mentioned Planned Parenthood earlier, and I kind of got to thinking about how the health needs of sexual minority women tend to be underserved, I think, both in general healthcare and mental health settings, but also maybe even in women's health specifically. At least that's my perception, and maybe the research bears that out. I'm not really familiar enough with the research to say. But I was wondering if you have any comments or ideas or, partnerships or initiatives or anything to say about ideas on how to serve the specific needs of sexual minority women in healthcare?
I'll comment where I can, although, as you say, I think the data will bear out your hypothesis there that it has been underserved. So I think largely until, I'd say even 5, maybe 10, probably 5 years ago, the funding for LGBT research was largely driven by HIV. And so it largely went to men who have sex with men, studies around that population. Originally, it was directed toward gay-identified men, and then they realized, wait, we're missing large groups. So it went more toward the MSM language. But unfortunately, this work is not free or even cheap to do, and so it winds up getting done by the people who have the funding, and the government typically controls the purse strings on that. So they have set the agenda for so long around one subset of the LGBTQ community, and it is only in recent years that they've started to expand the idea of who might we need to serve and why. I actually think this is one of the benefits of our explicitly taking the minority stress approach and looking at the importance of society and social interactions and identity in determining health outcomes, because that applies to everybody. That's not about one specific disease, and it's not even a disease-centered approach. It's really an identity-centered approach. So all people can be studied and understood and benefited by interventions that result from this kind of work and this kind of perspective. in terms of how we benefit the health of sexual minority women, I think that maybe gets to more of a cultural competence perspective. So as we train our clinicians, and I think specifically physicians here, but other types of clinicians, therapists as well, to be more understanding and accepting and inclusive of the LGBTQ community, I think you will see better outcomes because you will see people start to drop their assumptions about what women are when they come into the clinic, and they come from more of an interesting, investigative framework as opposed to an assuming some sort of normativity framework. I don't know if those of you who are actually practicing therapists want to weigh in on that.
Amy, you get the last question.
Oh boy, I'll make it a hard one. So we've had a couple questions about the kind of populations that you study and serve. My question is more about who's doing the research, who's doing the asking, and how we welcome a larger community into that. I've seen the same thing that I myself have experienced here, where there's a question about race and intersectionality. There's a pause, and everyone looks at the brown guy. And there's a question about women, and there's a pause, and then the woman speaks up. I've been that person, right? The only LGBT person, or the only whatever in the room. How do we get to a point where we have a diversity of people on this panel? And I recognize everyone's not here today and all that stuff. So that when we're going out and talking to people and collecting data, those people see someone, maybe who looks a little bit like that. When you're analyzing data, maybe, that population is a little familiar to you. We've got different voices when we're doing that analysis. And then when you're presenting your results, people are seeing someone who looks like them talking about this work, and maybe it's more relatable. That's a hard thing. I think a lot of us, in all the different places we work, struggle with that. How in your panel, and maybe this is more a question for Sherry, but really for anyone, how do you welcome people into your group when you're trying to recruit people into your team?
It's a great question, and I think it's something we're constantly working on. I don't know that there is an easy answer to it, other than I'd say from the welcoming people to the team perspective, if you want to do good work, we'll take you. Like we want everyone and anyone who is committed to health equity, who's going to fight for justice and wants to use the tools of science to do it. So I don't know that everybody takes that approach, but I feel like just knowing my colleagues kind of in the field, I think everybody feels this is an underserved area and we just want more people. I think it tends to attract the population that, we're studying, but I don't think it has to. We have a number of people on our team who do not identify with the community but are here to do good work, and great, and we'll take all comers. I think the piece that can be overlooked sometimes, only because nobody wants to talk about, the people out there who don't understand and don't get it, but those are the ones we really have to reach. I was giving a talk last weekend on just the very basics of methods for studying the LGBTQ population, and specifically LGBTQ youth, and just sort of the state of the science, what we know. And I was approached by somebody afterward from one of the nature journals who wants me to write a commentary, and I've never had that happen before, so I was really excited. But I was realizing, we're already publishing the work that, I spoke about in the talk. I said, but I don't think that matters, because what I need to communicate to the nature readers is this is how you get this population into your studies if you're not an LGBTQ health equity researcher. If you're out there studying cancer or studying, drinking or whatever it is, and you're thinking about general populations, I actually need to be talking to you about how not to alienate this community so that there's broader representation of this community in broad science studies. And I think that's probably one of the missing pieces. As we start doing that, and as we start getting the broader population of scientists understanding the importance of including this population in their work, I think you'll see the same effects work their way up through the chain and through the pipeline, where what we really need is to create a more inclusive world.
Exactly. Yeah, it's all hands on deck.
Yeah.
When it comes to that, I think what I was thinking as you were asking that question is that it's one of the fundamental human crises in the United States oppression, and it is going to require all of us in all domains of our lives to identify and work against barriers that exist. So it's not an easy, it's not an easy history, and it's not an easy present.
Yeah. And also like minority issues among minorities, the minorities among minorities issues, they always get sidelined, and it just like it takes a longer time to get those things in the right place. I mean like I'm not very sure about it, but I think like after Cary and I came to the program and we started saying like we specifically want to work with transgender and gender non-conforming adolescent populations, and I think after that we have started focusing way too much on like the sense like we started like developing studies around that and everything. So I think that sometimes it takes therefore I like the diversity part of it, like that you need people from different backgrounds, different interest area to come in. For example, like at the center, we have like, we all work on same projects because we're working over there, but we also have a very individual specific research interest, which kind of really makes things interesting. So therefore like we really want more people just come in with whatever they are interested in and then see like how best way we can support, work together, or just support the research that way.
You guys are amazing. That is like right on time. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. We appreciate it. Miguel, I'm turning it back to you.